The mainstream media has had a pretty difficult week when it comes to their legitimacy because after promoting the Russiagate story for months uncritically, it's finally catching up to them, and they're now finally being scrutinized for their reckless coverage. So in an article for The Intercept, Glenn Greenwald writes, 3 prominent CNN journalists resigned Monday night after the network was forced to retract and apologize for a story linking Trump ally Anthony Scaramucci to a Russian investment fund under congressional investigation. That article, like so much Russia reporting from the US media, was based on a single anonymous source, and now the network cannot vouch for the accuracy of its central claims. In announcing the resignation of the 3 journalists, Thomas Frank, who wrote the story, not the same Thomas Frank who wrote What's the Matter with Kansas, Pulitzer Prize-winning reporter Eric Lichtblau, recently hired away from the New York Times, and Lex Harris, head of a new investigative unit, CNN said that standard editorial processes were not followed when the article was published. The resignations follow CNN's Friday night retraction of the story, in which it apologized to Scaramucci. Now that states, on June 22nd, CNN published a story connecting Anthony Scaramucci with investigations into the Russian Direct Investment Fund. That story did not meet CNN's editorial standards and has been retracted. Links to the story have been disabled. CNN apologizes to Mr. Scaramucci. But CNN is hardly alone when it comes to embarrassing retractions regarding Russia. Over and over, major US media outlets have published claims about the Russia threat that turned out to be completely false, always in the direction of exaggerating the threat and/or inventing incriminating links between Moscow and the Trump circle. In virtually all cases, those stories involved evidence-free assertions that anonymous sources that these media outlets uncritically treated as fact, only for it to be revealed that they were entirely false. Several of the most humiliating of these episodes have come from the Washington Post. On December 30th, the paper published a blockbuster frightening scoop that immediately and predictably went viral and generated massive traffic. Russian hackers, the paper claimed based on anonymous sources, had hacked into the US electricity grid through a Vermont utility, and of course that turned out to be false. Now a few weeks later, C-SPAN made big news when it announced that its network had been interrupted by RT programming. They stated, "This afternoon the online feed for C-SPAN was briefly interrupted by RT programming. We are currently investigating and troubleshooting this occurrence, as RT is one of the networks who we regularly monitor. We are operating under the assumption that it was an internal routing issue. If that changes, we will certainly let you know." That led numerous media outlets such as Fortune to claim that this occurred due to Russian hacking, yet that too turned out to be totally baseless, and Fortune was forced to renounce the claim. In the same time period, December of 2016, The Guardian published a story by reporter Ben Jacobs claiming that WikiLeaks and its founder, Julian Assange, had, quote, long had a close relationship with the Putin regime. That claim, along with several others in the story, was fabricated, and The Guardian was forced to append a retraction to the story. Perhaps the most significant Russia falsehood came from CrowdStrike, the firm hired by the DNC to investigate the hack of its email servers. Again, in the same time period, December of 2016, the firm issued a new report accusing Russian hackers of nefarious activities involving the Ukrainian army, which numerous outlets, including, of course, the Washington Post, uncritically hyped. Yet, that story also fell short. In March, the firm revised and retracted statements it used to buttress claims of Russian hacking during last year's American presidential election campaign. After several experts questioned its claims, and CrowdStrike walked back key parts of its Ukraine report. So we have multiple stories here that have proven to be false. I mean, we have mainstream news outlets who took these stories from anonymous sources. They didn't do their research enough. They accepted the claims of these anonymous sources uncritically, and they ended up embarrassing themselves. So you see a trend here. They're jumping on this Russia bandwagon because, one, it's an easy way to attack Trump, and two, most importantly, this gets them ratings. But that's not all. So one of the main claims of the Russiagate story has been recently retracted by the New York Times. So according to Consortium News, they add that the New York Times has finally admitted that one of the favorite Russiagate canards, that all 17 U.S. intelligence agencies concurred on the assessment of Russian hacking of Democratic emails, is false. Now, in the retraction for the New York Times, they state a White House memo article on Monday about President Trump's deflections and denials about Russia referred incorrectly to the source of an intelligence assessment that said Russia orchestrated hacking attacks during last year's presidential election. The assessment was made by 4 intelligence agencies: the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, the Central Intelligence Agency, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and the National Security Agency. The assessment was not approved by all 17 organizations in the American intelligence community. So for months now, the Democratic Party has been labeling anyone who doesn't jump on board with this Russia hacking conspiracy theory as people who are shills for Trump or shills for Russia specifically, because 17 American intelligence agencies have determined that they did in fact hack into the DNC's and John Podesta's emails, but now actually it wasn't all 17. It was 4, and you know, the oddest part about the story is that they've been talking about the 17 intelligence agencies for months, and they only decided to issue a correction for that on June 25th. So this is completely reckless because, one, it encourages Donald Trump and both political parties to ramp up tensions between the United States and Russia, and what they're doing is empowering Donald Trump. I mean, after all these claims, false claims about Russia have been proven to be just complete bullshit, now Donald Trump, when he actually says, you know, all these stories about me, they're false, now there's legitimacy to Donald Trump. The media delegitimized themselves, and they propped up Donald Trump, so his claim about CNN being fake news now actually has some credence.
You are fake news.
So good job in your effort to promote hysteria and be alarmist when it comes to Russia, when the Cold War's been over for decades now. In your effort to sensationalize this story, all for ratings, you've made Donald Trump exponentially more powerful. And when he talks about media bias against him specifically, now people are more inclined to believe him because of your reckless behavior. Good job, CNN. Good job, New York Times. Good job, The Guardian. I mean, what you're doing here is unacceptable. Your job is to scrutinize this information for the American people, but you're accepting claims from anonymous sources uncritically, and then you're reporting to the American people that these are facts when they're not facts. They're claims from anonymous sources. Again, if they actually believed in what they were saying, they would reveal their names. So this whole thing is really frustrating to me. Now, that's just kind of one portion of the story. This article that Glenn Greenwald wrote, which is just fantastic, it's one portion of the story because a lot of people are talking about James O'Keefe's video from Project Veritas, where basically he allegedly got a CNN producer on tape saying that they're doing all this for ratings and it's bullshit. And then he also apparently caught Van Jones of CNN saying that this whole Russia thing is just a nothing burger. But let me say this. James O'Keefe, like the mainstream media, he is very disingenuous and he does have an agenda. So I don't trust anything that James O'Keefe says. And furthermore, when it comes to the CNN executive admitting that they're doing this for ratings, yeah, no shit, Sherlock. That's something that's been obvious to all of us who are paying attention. And Van Jones, that honestly isn't that big of a story to me because just a couple of days prior to that video being released, Van Jones actually released a video talking about how he doesn't believe there's going to be much evidence that Donald Trump did in fact collude with Russia.
I am glad that there is a Russia investigation, and I hope they get to the bottom of it. I think Democrats are fooling ourselves if we think that something's going to come out of this investigation and somehow is going to end the Trump presidency and make everything better. Unless there's a real smoking gun, which there's probably not, it's just going to be a big old mess. Meanwhile, we're not talking about jobs, not talking about poverty, not talking about solutions, not talking about the addiction crisis. Let's talk about our stuff.
So the James O'Keefe portion, that portion, it means nothing to me, honestly. These retractions and corrections issued by numerous mainstream media outlets, that's what we should focus on because, again, James O'Keefe, he has zero legitimacy whatsoever. He likes to take the footage and edit it in the most disingenuous way possible so that way he takes people out of context. So I don't believe anything that James O'Keefe is selling, and furthermore, what he allegedly revealed is nothing new. So if you're progressive, anything that you see released from Project Veritas, take it with a grain of salt. But we don't need Project Veritas and James O'Keefe to confirm what we already know. These retractions lend credence to the claim that progressives have been saying forever, that this Russia story, even if it is true, You're reporting it irresponsibly. You're being reckless in the way you're sensationalizing it. And furthermore, if you want to attack Donald Trump, do it in a way that will actually stick. But they continue to harp on Russia when that is not the most effective way to attack Trump. So all these stories here confirms that the media has an agenda, and their agenda is to make money. And this story, it's making them so much money. Think about all the viewers that Rachel Maddow picked out. We need evidence. Extraordinary claims require evidence. I shouldn't have to say this to the media, who's supposed to be the real journalists, but again, we have to say it. So anything that you hear from the mainstream media, you shouldn't just accept it as gospel. You need to be critical, and critical of everyone who has a large platform, myself included. So, yeah, their behavior has been reckless, and I'm glad that finally people are holding them accountable and they're embarrassing themselves as a result of their terribly irresponsible coverage of the Russiagate story.
Support this podcast by joining the independent progressive media revolution today at humanistreport.com.